humans are storytelling apes. Okay. And so in the absence of a good story, they'll make up their own narrative. Okay. And so what you have to do, and this is increasingly true, sadly, in a post-truth world, which we seem to live in, there's lots of narratives out there and people can pick, they've got a lot to choose from in terms of the stories. And like I said, if they don't have a good one, they'll make one up. So the first job of leadership is to explain why smart people that they're working with should get out of bed in the morning and come and play their game, whatever their game may be, right? That's the first job, tell a good story. And then the second, and if you can't do that, the smart people have got plenty of options. They're going to go and do something else. And so then the second thing is peers should collaborate to work out what to do, not how, but what. And then the trick of good management is to get out of the way, I think, and let smart people work out how to do the things that you've hired them to do.
Welcome to the Overcommitted podcast, your weekly dose of real engineering conversations. I'm your host this week, Brittany Ellick, and I am joined by...
Hey, I'm Bethany.
And I'm Erica.
The three of us met while working on a team at GitHub and quickly realized we were all obsessed with getting better at what we do. So we decided to start this podcast to share what we're learning. We'll be talking about everything from leveling up your technical skills to navigating your professional development, all with the goal of creating a community where engineers can learn and connect. Today, we're sitting down with Matt Sinclair, an Aussie software engineering leader and former partner and VP of engineering at BCG Digital Ventures, who's dedicated to building the digital future. Matthew's journey started not with the Commodore 64 he craved, but with a Mercurial TI-99 that unexpectedly spurred his passion for programming, leading to a career that includes building everything from high-performance payment systems to shared mobility platforms. We'll dive into what it takes to anticipate and build the future with BITS, the intersection of technology and business strategy, and his passion for coaching the next generation of engineering leaders. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, thank you. That was a lovely intro. Thanks, Brittany.
Absolutely. So we love to talk about tech that people are passionate about. And it sounds like you're a big advocate for Elixir, calling it the most future-proof and AI-aligned language. And I would love to hear more about that.
You're quoting my clickbaity headline from a post I did a few weeks back. Look, what can I tell you? I've been around for a long time and I get very frustrated with religious arguments about things. And one of the best things about Elixir is that it just answers a whole bunch of questions that you don't have to relitigate and debate with people out of the box. So I'm an old functional programmer from way, way back. I did Lisp and Scheme at university 40 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, whenever that was. When was 1990? Yeah. 35 years ago. So I know I was a Java programmer like everyone, and then a Ruby programmer, and I kind of got a bit disenchanted with programming a little bit. And the further up the leadership hierarchy you go, the further away from software you get often. And anyway, and so I came across Elixir about 2019, I think, and it was a revelation because I was just like, oh my gosh, this thing has everything in the one box. So you don't have to make all these these tech stacks decisions about Kubernetes or Redis or a bunch of stuff just comes out of the box. And so I started tinkering with it, and I wasn't really writing anything serious. I was still at BCG DV, but I just kept plugging away at it and kind of after probably 10 years or so, or 7-8 years of not really writing code, I felt like I needed to get my gym fitness back from writing code after having written a lot of code in the past and then not writing much. And I just got into it and got more and more, felt more and more in love with it. It has it's kind of like there's a software engineers, that thing when you write something and it kind of feels right. It's got this sort of elegance to it, and it just kind of clicks. I don't know what that is. It's very hard to put your finger on, right? Like when you write something, cracky, that really feels great. And Elixir's full of that kind of stuff. It's just very joy-inducing, which I know sounds crazy, right, for a software programming language, but it's, when you spend so much time on a daily basis writing something, if you have to battle with it the whole time, I think it becomes exhausting. And at least of the languages that I know, that's the one that has it's the least exhausting that I've come across so far. I mean, that's the conceptual aesthetic version of it. But from a very practical point of view, it's very fast. It's very complete. There's the folks in the ecosystem are great. I don't know what your preferred programming language is, but one of the things I learned over the years is there's a very strong correlation between functional programming and high quality software engineers. I don't know what that is. And I don't know whether it's just because functional programming's got a bit of a steeper learning curve, maybe to get into it, particularly if you're coming from OO. I think if you come to it naturally first, it doesn't have that at all. But if you're coming, you have to sort of unlearn a bunch of stuff about OO when you go to a functional programming language. So, it's, I don't know, a bunch of stuff that just makes it fun to use. So I don't know. I get a bit evangelical about it, which I know is ironic considering I was suggesting that I don't get religious about things. But yeah. Look, and there's a really good there's really good use cases of Elixir being used at scale that people don't really know about. So Discord and WhatsApp was actually on Erlang, but it's the same underlying VM. And a few other ones, and there's a few hedge funds that use it. I know here in London, and they keep very quiet about it because for two reasons. One is because it's so productive, and they would prefer other hedge fund engineers to be using less productive languages for obvious reasons, but it has a kind of ecosystem lock-in thing from an employee point of view as well, because it's a niche programming language, right? There's no doubt about it. But the folks who do use it love it, and so you want to find other Elixir shops so you can make use of it as well. So it's got a bit of a, maybe it's a virtuous cycle, I think, from one direction to think about it. I don't know. Other than that, I've spent the last 9 months, what is it now? Oh, it's November, so 11 months writing software, on a pretty full-on basis, whereas I hadn't the previous 10 years. I wasn't really writing software, and I think I've written more software in that time than probably in the previous 15 years of my life, just in terms of productive output. So yeah, I can't speak highly enough of it. Not everyone's using it. I think it's in the kind of 5% range. It's the most loved, and Phoenix is the most loved. So when people who use it vote, you say you use Python or Ruby or whatever, and you say, how much do you like it? It comes in at whatever. The Elixir Phoenix folks using it seem to really love it. So I know that feels like it's a good thing.
That sounds...
Sorry, Brittany. I used Elixir for a couple Advent of codes, and I had so much fun with it. It really is a fun programming language. But I was curious if you have any tips for folks who maybe never learned functional programming formally and how they can start learning or understanding that pattern.
A few things clicked for me. Like it was a long time since I'd used it from back at the university, and as anyone knows who is a few years out of university, you sort of go in knowing nothing and sometimes come out of university knowing even less. So I wouldn't say that I was an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But after, maybe say 20 odd years, 25 years or so of programming, coming to it, a couple of things really just like clicked for me. Immutable data structures. I mean, I'm going to get really nerdy, but immutable data structures and pure functions save you from about, 50%, like 50% of the kind of bugs that you would get in normal code just aren't possible with that. Now, it's not that you don't have any bugs. That's, of course, that's not true. There's plenty of bugs. But pure functions, you can just test them in isolation. And with immutable data, you know that you're not going to get side effects. And so those two things alone, I would sort of... I'd make the point that's like, trust me on this. This is good. And once you get across the river and you realize, yeah, okay, I see. So that's the first thing. Those two things just improve productivity enormously. But the other thing is this chaining of functions, composable functions. Once you get you make a data structure, and then you make these functions that do a little bit of mutation on the data structure, and you chain them together. Once you get that kind of thing working, it's super cool. And there's a really and non-obvious unintended consequence of all those three things is that it makes it very easy for a coding agent to reason about the software, way easier than in mutable languages. So part of that productivity boost that I got this year has been because I've been using Claude Code with Elixir, and it's a great combination. Because Claude's probably the better programming foundation model, at least in my experience, but it's very good at reasoning about pure functional code because there's no side effects. So you can basically, I wrote a sub-agent for Claude called Elixir Doctor, and I got all my coding standards, and every now and again when I've got nothing to do, I'll go, Elixir Doctor, just do your worst on this module. And because you can change the internals of a function, as long as you don't change what comes in and what goes out, it'll just fix it. right? And so you can turn really, really terrible nested if-then conditionals, which is what Claude will do on its own if you just let it go. You can turn it into these really pure functional chains across the data structure. Anyway, and I don't know, the first time I did it, I went, I don't really understand what I'm doing. And then it kind of clicked and I went, oh, right, okay, now I see it. And I see everything now in these data structures and pipelines of functions. So I don't know whether that appeals to anyone, but it kind of, it's a very, that sounds super nerdy, but it feels very fulfilling when you get one of these things written and it works pretty well. And then because of the LLM interaction, I mean, I feel like I've got a team of 5 engineers working for me now. And I sit here and I write code and I'll sit now and I'll rubber duck a design with Claude there. And you end up spending way more time up front, I think, than I probably would have in the past in terms of design, but you nut something out. And then all of a sudden, it's just writing this code. You go, hang on, no, don't do that, do this. And it makes some silly mistakes from time to time that you have to rectify. But at the end of it, you can kind of have at least 2, often I have two Claude sessions going, operating on these, I wrote this thing called intent, which is it's like a bunch of little sort of helpers to help Claude to allow me to help Claude help me, right? And it's just a free, what do you call it, like an open source thing I put on GitHub. And what it does, I have this concept called a steel thread. And so a steel thread is like a piece of functionality that I can describe. And the reason it's called intent is because what I'm doing is I'm capturing the intent about a piece of software. And so if you think about when you're writing software, you often don't capture the intent, or you might capture it a little bit in comments, but you don't really do it. But doing it in a systematic way with a steel thread and then a bunch of work packages in that steel thread, what it does is it stops context explosion. So you get this little chunk of documentation, and you can then come back to the problem when you reset your context window. You come back to the problem, and you just have to ingest the steel thread, and it gets back up to speed. And then what you end up doing over time is you sort of leave this trail of intent, which is super interesting. You have these steel threads, and you complete them and so on. But at any point, you can go, oh, I want to pick up steel thread 17, go and read that and come back to me and tell me, right? And then you put it in ultra-think mode. You say ultra-think this steel thread, and then come back and tell me what's next. And it's rather than it have to relearn the entire code base every time you turn it on, which just doesn't work. And I think when you hear people's frustration when they're talking about coding agents, a lot of it is around, the context window is not big enough, or I spend all my time trying to keep it on the rails. What intent does is it just helps me help it keep it on the rails so it can be much, much more effective. And so these combination of things, like, it's kind of happy accident. I didn't set out for that to be true, but Elixir was fun. I started using Claude, and it was a disaster in the early part of it. I did this, I was writing this thing, and I reckon I wrote 200,000 lines of code, of which 150,000 were complete rubbish. And something occurred to me actually a little bit later on. I've got a bit about it, but what occurred to me a bit later on was I was like seduced by this machine that was emitting all this code, just really, really seduced by it. And I felt like I was on superpowers. And then I realized that most of it was complete crap. And what happened, it took me a while to realize it. It sort of did 2 or 3 rewrites of this thing before I realized. And I came up with this analogy to try and describe it to someone that and I'm not trying to suggest that I'm Michelangelo. So please, if you want to send a letter to Brittany. Don't send it to me. I'm not suggesting I'm Michelangelo, but he said that in that David was inside the block of marble and he just had to find it. And so I feel the same way about coding agents, in that the difference between a Muppet with no experience and someone with 30 years experience is they'll both generate 200,000 lines of code. And the difference between the two is that some person who knows what they're doing knows which 150,000 to throw away. Right. And that's the thing. And so I don't know if we want to have a whole conversation about AI and coding agents and so on, but there's a real polarized points of view about coding agents. Like the classic Hacker News the whole world's polarized at the moment, but Hacker News is an example of this as well. You've got one side of the argument is sort of, I'll never have to write code again. We don't need software engineers. Claude, the GPT is we're just going to chat all software into existence. Obvious nonsense. But the other extreme is also quite stupid, that these things don't work. They don't help you. They hallucinate. That's nonsense as well. And if you know what you're doing, you can be crazily productive with these things. Now, even after 12 months of doing this, I still find myself, like today, like yelling at it, anthropomorphizing this thing yelling at it because it had done something stupid, and I have to get up and walk away from my desk and go, I'm not actually talking to a human. This is a machine. Escape, Control C, get out, start again. All right, reset. But the truth of this is I think you know in the notes that you sent me, this mech suit idea, which is another metaphor that I came up with. It's a coding agent's like a mech suit. It's like Ripley in Alien. You if you know what you're doing, like if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to hurt yourself and everyone around you. Right? They're literally lethal. But if you do know what you're doing, then you can kill the alien and live happily ever after. And that's how I see it. It's like a mech suit that you need to learn how to use. And once you pick up and there are definite skills that come from this. Being able to. It's not so much prompt engineering, but it's sort of like controlling the agent it's like a parenting exercise. It's parenting instead of programming, teaching the agent to work in your best interest. Anyway, so like I said, happy accident between Elixir and Claude. They work very, very well together, and it's been very effective for me.
If for no other reason than like the pure fun of imagining myself in a mech suit, I'm like going to steal that imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and thanks for sharing a little bit about your workflow too. Yeah, it's, I mean, it seems very situational, and kind of like you said, like setting up the situation, providing all the tooling, like providing the feedback for like a successful AI assisted development situation. Like that in itself is a skill. Yeah, and like you said, like the view of the person in command like is still so valuable, of like knowing when to go in one direction or another, when to shut it down. Yeah. How do you, like, in that flow that you're talking about, like what are the intervention points? So you're talking about like you sort of like build, it almost sounds like I'm understanding like mini context windows based on like iterations, and then how do you test along the along the workflow that you're moving in the right direction?
I've just dropped in the chat there the GitHub link, so you can have a look at intent, and maybe you can put in the show notes if anyone's interested in it. And full disclosure, no warranties. It's very much my workflow, and I can't guarantee that it'll work for anyone else, but it works for me. But to your point, Erica, so I find it very useful to generate tests as I go, right? Rather than sort of in advance, I get it to write something, and then I get it to test it. And then what I've learned is it's actually really, really bad at writing tests cold. It'll sort of write a lot of tests, but they're not very good, right? And so I constantly have to, when something doesn't work, I've got to constantly go back to it and say, you're testing implementation, not behavior. I want you to test the behavior. And so I end up, it'll generate 1,000 lines of tests, and I'll throw away the same ratio, right? 3/4 of it, and get it when a bug happens, I'll get it to write a test that tests for the bug, which is sort of what a human would do anyway, right? But it's just way quicker at it than me writing it. And what I find as well is, this is a whole other story here, but traditionally, if you had to stack the cost of writing software in a stack, right? You've got, okay, I need to think about the problem. I need to sort of write down what I think the problem, the answer might be, and iterate it, talk to someone, rub a duck, whatever. And then I have to write the code. And so depending on how good you are as an engineer, you might allocate different amounts of time to those buckets. Okay. And I would argue that the vast majority of engineers, unfortunately, spend most of their time writing code and not anywhere near enough time in the first phases, because we've all been sort of told that you just need to write code and iterate it and so on, right? What Claude does, or coding agents do, is they effectively reduce the time cost of writing the code to zero, or almost zero. Okay. And so what that does is it gives you a bunch of extra time that you didn't have before, to spend more in the thinking about what you're going to do. And this rubber ducking thing, like Claude's really good at it. I say, I want to, the rubber duck metaphor, I sit there and explain a problem to a rubber duck. Yeah. Okay. So I even tell it that, like, right, I want to rubber duck with you this thing. And it gets quite amusing. It's trying to be funny, not always funny, but we'll sit there and go backwards and forwards with a design. And then often the design that comes out, it writes a pretty good design. You go, right, bang, go and do it. But then you've got, this is where the pruning starts, right? Because it'll emit a bunch of the code, and then you have to prune it back. But anyway, that's a rather circuitous way to say that the time cost of writing code, like your fingers on keys time, is sort of like that bit of the software engineering, which I know is not the total time. It's must, the hard parts about software engineering are often the human parts, not the software parts. But that bit's now zero. Okay. Or not zero, but it might as well be zero. So you get all this other time to spend thinking about it up front, and you've got this sparring partner, this intellectual sparring partner, which you can think about it with. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but that's if your question was, how's my workflow changed, or what's my workflow, how to keep it on track, I spend way more time now thinking and rubber ducking design than I ever did before. I used to be the design with code school, because you never really know what problem you're solving, so you sort of experiment, and the code's the canvas, and so you're just sort of iterating on the code. I don't do that anywhere near as much as I used to, if at all, to be honest. Whereas I used to do that probably all the time.
For sure, yeah. And I also have found that idea of designing something in multiple ways to like come up with the sort of like best version out of like multiple ideas, like that cost is so much lower with AI assisted development, because you can kind of spike out like not necessarily like production ready versions, but like what would this idea look like? What would this idea look like? Like, let's compare them, see what I want to take from both of those, and then maybe like throw one away entirely or create something totally new.
In intent, I've written a bunch of subagents in intent that fit into Claude, and one of them is called Socrates. And the Socrates subagent, what Socrates does is I set up some context for it, and I give it to Socrates and Plato. So Socrates is the CTO, and it's the context there, and Plato is the lead engineer with the problem. And I get it to go off and do a Socratic dialogue on a problem. And so it's got my input context, and then it goes away and thinks about it. And the output, this seems insane, right? Like even 5 years ago, if you'd have told me this was a thing, I would have gone, you are smoking crack. There's no way this could possibly even be a thing ever. And however, the results of this is extraordinary. Right? Like it'll crack the hardest architectural problems or even optimization problems, things going wrong. It goes off, it spends 10 minutes, banging away. And then it comes back and it says, right, here's this 10-page Socratic dialogue between Socrates and Plato where they're evaluating the code and the problem. And as you said, actually, the really interesting thing is it's amazing when you say, give me options and evaluate those options. Right? It seems to lift a gear when it's evaluating options against itself, or when it's arguing against itself. It's super powerful. But anyway, that's in intent as one of the subagents. The Socrates subagent. I use it every day.
It kind of reminds me of all the stories of creating DeepMind, who played Go, and the way they trained it was like actually like replicating a second version and playing against itself for like a month straight of like, I think the numbers is like it played more games of Go than a single human could in like 100 lifetimes or something. It's like
if I remember correctly, I vaguely recalled that they ran out of games. So they had historical game data, and they ran out of historical games for it to play, and so they got it doing exactly what you said, playing against itself. And in some very short period of time, it had played more games than have ever been played by humans in Go, right? Ever. Right. And so it's it's exactly the same thing. Like it was, for whatever reason, that really, and obviously Go goes way more complicated than chess. And what was his name? Lee Sedol got beaten by AlphaGo whenever it was. And it's like, okay, game playing is a solved problem for computers now.
Yeah. Super interesting. Well, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, to pivot a little from the engineering side to the more leadership side. So, as I understand, you've scaled a lot of teams from very minimal sizes to large sizes. And so I'm curious if you have any core philosophies on technical leadership or any mistakes that a lot of new managers or new leaders make when they're coming into a role like that.
Yes, I know a lot of mistakes because I made them and learned the lessons way too late. Look, the first one I say this to everyone I'm coaching or working with, is this basic why, what, how breakdown. And it's a little bit different to the classic sales start with why, because I think they say why, how, what, but I spin this around for leadership and management. I spin this around a little bit. And so my basic pitch to people is that humans are storytelling apes. Okay. And so in the absence of a good story, they'll make up their own narrative. Okay. And so what you have to do, and this is increasingly true, sadly, in a post-truth world, which we seem to live in, there's lots of narratives out there and people can pick, they've got a lot to choose from in terms of the stories. And like I said, if they don't have a good one, they'll make one up. So the first job of leadership is to explain why smart people that they're working with should get out of bed in the morning and come and play their game, whatever their game may be, right? That's the first job. Tell a good story. And then the second, and if you can't do that, the smart people have got plenty of options. They're going to go and do something else. And so then the second thing is peers should collaborate to work out what to do, not how, but what. And then the trick of good management is to get out of the way, I think, and let smart people work out how to do the things that you've hired them to do. So that why, what, how thing, I use that everywhere. The other thing that I say to people about leadership and management is that management is not a promotion, it's a career change. Okay, I didn't coin that phrase, someone else coined it. But the interesting thing that they also don't tell you is that leadership is a career change from management. Okay, and that one is like, that's a footnote at the back of the advanced textbook. You don't really get that one. And so a lot of people, when they go into leadership positions, treat it as management, and it's not the same thing. Okay. And so that little lesson alone, just knowing that that's a thing, that when I'm becoming a manager and moving out of IC to management, and our podcast that I've mentioned before, What Next, is actually based on this premise that interesting things happen at boundary conditions, on the boundaries, right? So when you change from something to something else, that's when interesting stuff happens. And the palliative that I give to the flailing new manager or new leader is that your worst day in the job is today. Right? Because today you've learned something and tomorrow you'll know a little bit more than you knew today. So it can only get better. And the worst time you'll ever have as a manager or a leader is the first day, your first day in the job. And again, it's one of these little things about just knowing that is very helpful, because it allows you to lift your head a little bit and go, oh, okay, right, today was terrible, but I learned something. So now I'm going to be better tomorrow. So I don't know, those two or three things are pretty interesting. The other one is, the last one is a bit more general, not really management related, but I'm a big believer in values. And what I mean by that is that if you've got shared values, this works across the board, socially, and family relationships and so on. If you've got shared values, you can kind of get through just about anything. And if you don't have shared values, it's hard, much, much harder. And so it's not that everyone has to have the same values, but when you're selecting for things, it's probably a good idea to try and pull people together that have similar values. So if you need to do, exploit something or, go really sort of hustle, then you want people who have a kind of hustling mentality. If you want to do something a bit more nurturing and a bit more, whatever, holistic, then you probably want people who share those values. And it's when you mix that up, you tend to get a bit of friction. So yeah, that's another bit of advice that I'd give to people. It's very easy to say, of course, from here, but it's just one of those things. Just knowing it is quite handy.
Do you have like a reference of values that you go from, or are they usually like self-described?
I have my own that I stick with, which are more or less what I've said to you so far. Why, what, how. Actually, the first one I have is be intentional about your values. This is one of the things I say, particularly people in startups where you're growing a business, and that there's no such thing as no culture. There will always be a culture, and you can have an intentional culture or an unintentional culture. And so as a CEO of a small business in trying to grow something, it's pretty important that you're intentional about the culture. Otherwise, you'll get a culture that you may not have, you may not have wanted, or worse, you end up a culture that's just based on the bad behaviors of the most senior people. All right, which I'm sure we've all seen. We've all experienced that, and it's pretty toxic. So the first one is, be intentional about having some values and communicate them. There's a bit of a test that you can use with this, which is actually, if I make a slight diversion, I think the role of the CTO, just to bring it back to something practical, the role of the CTO is what I call your role is actually Chief Vocabulary Officer. And what I mean by that is it's your job to come up with the words that people use to communicate, because as the CTO, you've got a foot in both camps, right? You should know the technology, obviously, that's self-evident, but you also should know the business, and you should know the product, and you should know the people, okay? And so it's your job as the CTO to emit the words that people can use to communicate with each other and without feeling uncomfortable, and they can talk about progress and status and so on. So yeah, have some values, be intentional about it. There's no such thing as no culture. You are as a founder and CEO of business, you are the culture ultimately, and you have to demonstrate it. As the CTO, your job is to come up with a vocabulary that people can use. Why, what, how is very effective. Always remember that boundary conditions are really interesting, so they can be perilous, but they're also opportunities. And there's a guy that used to work for me. We had a really deep conversation one day, and people had been telling him all his career that he needed to change this particular behavior that he had. And it occurred to me at the time that I think sometimes it's really bad advice, because the way you are is really hard to change, right? And so what's better is just knowing how you are. Okay. And then if you know how you are, then you can maybe grab a mask from time to time and put a mask on to fit into a certain context or situation. But changing is exhausting or even impossible for many people. And so just knowing this is one of those situations where I'm going to lose it. And so I'm going to write a one pager for the meeting, submit it, and shut up, right? Or I'm one of those people who just talks in every empty space in a conversation. So I know that I'm going to go into the room, into this meeting, and I'm going to find the most junior person in the room, and I'm going to go and ask them what they're doing or how they're feeling, right? Or what they're working on, right? These are just sort of hacks that you come up with to get through it. But I don't know. I'm not sure there's any real recipe for any of this. If there was, we could hand it over to machines.
It sounds like you've sort of been on a journey to find out these things about you. Do you have any recommendations for somebody who wants to know these things about themselves? Or
gosh, that's a very deep question. I'm not sure that I do know, to be honest. I think I can kind of guess at it a little bit, and I've fumbled around in the dark a little bit. One thing that really helped me was I started writing down how I thought about stuff, and I don't have, I'm not a successful blogger or anything like this, right? But what I started doing was every Friday at Digital Ventures, when I was at Digital Ventures, something would happen through the week of it's a pretty intense environment. Something would happen, and I could be like a one-liner, and I would use that as the title of the blog post, and then I would put it out to the team. And in the end, I started putting it on Medium, it was internal, an email I did internally, and then I did it as a blog post on Medium. And what in the back of my mind, what I was thinking I was going to do was I was going to try and write a book about how to be an engineering leader. And it turned out that Will Larson did a way better job of that. And The Elegant Puzzle, it was the book that I wanted to write. And so I don't need to write that book anymore. But what I do know about writing, like a lot of creative activities, is that there's craft and there's art. Okay. So when most people look at something creative, they see the art, but they don't see the craft. So if you take a painting on a wall in an art gallery, you see the art, but what you don't see is someone understanding how light falls on paint and how you stretch a canvas, or how you mix paints or find ingredients for novel colors and so on. That no one sees that unless they themselves are in that domain. And I think leadership's a little bit like that as well, right? When you see a good leader, you sort of see the art of it, but you don't see the craft. And so I've tried to come up with these I call craft moves that I've collected over the years, which are just little lessons, and like the one about going into the meeting and talking to the most junior person and finding out what they're doing and shining a light on them, as it were, right? And just listening to what they say. Like it's a very good signal to give to a team to let someone have a voice. And it's not hard to do, right? It's a really, really easy thing to do. You just have to put your ego out of the way. I don't know. So right, back to the thread. Writing really helped me. What I found I was doing was, if you talk, like, a lot of these things that I'm saying are actually blog posts that I've written, and what happened was in writing it down, I went in from just mush to a coherent couple of paragraphs that made some sense, and that was super helpful. So in doing that, it turns an idea into, like, just a really rough idea into something that you can convey. And so I have this, like, one thing is this dolphins, not whales. Right. In a conversation one day at work, I was trying to explain to a client why we worked the way we did. And I said, it's a bit like a whale. If you think about a whale jumps out of the water, breaches out of the water and falls back. And if it's going the wrong way, it's got a huge arc that it has to turn around to come back to get on the right direction. And if you think of a dolphin's, really quick and agile, and they come up and out of the water all the time. And if they ever get it wrong, they're never wrong by very much. They can course correct. And so this whole dolphins, not whales thing became a mantra in DV. This is how we work. Dolphins, not whales. Anyway, and it was an accident, right? It was just a sort of conversational accident, but I turned it into a blog post, and then it became a thing. And it was like, oh, Matt, you have to come and do the dolphins, not whales presentation for this client. Yeah. So write stuff down. It's if an audience of you, right? I mean, it really was audience of me just writing it down. It helped me turn rubbish, messy ideas into something that I could repeat.
That, yeah. I think there's a lot of science behind that too, like the whole mindfulness and journaling and how it's just so good to like get all of your ideas out. This has been awesome. I don't think I've ever been excited about like checking out Elixir, but now I am. You've been a great evangelist for that. You have so many great ideas, and I'm so excited to dig into all of these links after this.
The Elixir community is very welcoming. The Slack's great. The Discord is really good. There's a bunch of really smart people in there. Definitely check it out. It's well worth your time.
That's awesome. Yeah, we'll include links to that in the show notes, and I will also check it out because it sounds cool. I love Bethany's idea. Advent of Code is coming up, so maybe I'll also take that challenge to do Elixir. We are coming up on time, so I want to transition a little bit to our fun segments. This week, we are going to be doing 2 truths and a lie. Matt, we know you have a few unique interests, like owning an electric mountain bike and a finger lime orchard in Australia. We want you to give us 3 statements about your life or career, and we have to guess which one is the lie.
Okay, we have to test my poker face now and tell me, see if you can tell what I'm lying. Okay, so in no particular order, 2 truths and a lie. I can say my alphabet backwards very, very quickly, and there's very few people in the world I know who can do that. My son, I spent some time teaching me how to do it. My grandma taught me how to do it. You'll know my surname's Sinclair. It's the second one. So I'm related to the Sinclairs of the Knights Templar, the second founding family of the Knights Templar, and the Rosicrucians, if you've been to the Roslin Church in Edinburgh, which was featured in, what's it called, Dan Brown's... what was that book called? Da Vinci Code. And last one, I have a reconstructed right ankle that looks like a bike chain under X-ray and does set off airport security when you go through.
Wow, you really took this assignment and made it really hard. This is great.
I was trying to do my alphabet backwards when you were saying that, and I got like 4 letters in.
ZYXWBETSRQPONMLKJHCFEDCBA.
All right, so
it's not that one.
True. So now
there was too much detail with that one.
Now you've got. I tried to put unnecessary detail into all of them. I mean, I may have just learned my alphabet. Backwards for this question. Well, you got a 50-50 chance now.
The second one is the lie.
That's what I was going to guess. Yeah. While there was detail in all of them, there wasn't that much personal detail in the second one.
Yeah, you're right. I put that one in because I would like it to be true. I keep waiting for the phone call to be admitted to the Knights Templar. It'd be quite cool, and the Illuminati, but it hasn't happened yet, so it may never happen. So no, that is the lie. Well done.
Darn. Well, I guess we'll never know.
My poker career is over. My poker career is over.
It was a very good lie.
It was good. Yeah, I was very convinced. This has been awesome. Matt, welcome. Where can people find you if they want to hear more from you? On the internet.
Very, very easy spot to start is MatthewSinclair.com. And you'll have to bear with me because I have this long-term project to bring down surveillance capitalism, which is probably a topic for another podcast. But I am slowly putting all of my content onto my own stack. So I was using Medium and so on. And rather than just simply do a simple static website, I decided to make my own tech stack for the CMS because I've got a bunch of websites. So MatthewSinclair.com is my personal website, but it may be a little bit patchy at the moment. It's all written in Elixir, and it's running on anyway, it doesn't matter if it's running. It's written in Elixir, and it's all part of a thing that I'm building called Luxor, which if you know what a Luxor is, it's a sort of really cool, very spicy soup from Singapore or Malaysia, and Luxor is like all the flavors. And so my idea is to put sort of all of the CMS functionality into this thing called Luxor, and I can very easily publish like a static site. Everyone, when they learn a new language, right, the first thing they do is write a static site publisher. So I did that, but I sort of did it on steroids with a bunch of other stuff. So I'm gonna release that as not too distant future. I was working on it here this evening. But yeah, MatthewSinclair.com. That's the best place to go.
Oh, I love that. Do you have RSS?
It does on
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, it does in fact, Luxor has by default, you can just automatically RSS you put .rss on the end of the URL and it'll give you an RSS feed for the blogs. It should. Test it out. Let me know.
I will. RSS is the future. It's a past, but it's also the future, I think. I agree with that.
Honestly, I'm so with you, right? This is part of my bring down surveillance capitalism thing. I think we need to go back to web rings and completely federated, non-data monopolist and networks of small special interest groups, not this algorithm, what do you call it, brain rot, crap.
Mm-hmm.
So
Love
yeah,
that.
I'm going to fight this campaign on my own. So join me if you come
Yes.
along.
Yes. I think we're all there with you for sure. This is great.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Overcommitted. If you like what you hear, please do follow, subscribe, or do whatever it is you like to do on the podcast app of your choice. Check us out on Blue Sky, especially if you are also interested in stepping away from surveillance capitalism, and share with your friends. Until next week, goodbye.